The evening air carried a quiet serenity, the kind that only falls over a house when the world outside has finally softened into dusk. Inside, Clara stood in her bedroom, her reflection framed by the soft glow of candlelight dancing across the walls. She adjusted the delicate lace of her wedding gown for what seemed like the 100th time, though the gown had long since settled comfortably around her shoulders. Tonight was not just any night, it was her wedding night, a moment she had imagined in fragments for years. Yet now that it had arrived, it felt as though time had slowed, stretching each heartbeat into something almost tangible. Clara had always lived in a world defined not by sound, but by sight, touch, and the unspoken language of emotion. Being deaf did not isolate her. It made her hyper-aware of nuances that others often missed. She felt music not in sound but in vibration, in the way the floor beneath her feet thrummed with life. She understood conversation through the dance of lips and the flicker of expressions, the subtle tilt of a head, the curve of a smile. Yet as she stood before the mirror, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of apprehension. Tonight her vulnerability would be laid bare, not just physically but emotionally in ways that only true intimacy could demand. Across the room, Ethan watched her. He was a man of quiet demeanor, one whose presence carried a weight heavier than words. He had learned long ago that silence could speak louder than any vow, and his eyes had become the instruments through which he communicated his feelings. In Ethan's gaze, Clara saw unwavering devotion, admiration, and a depth of love so profound that it seemed to fill the space between them like sunlight streaming through a window. He did not need to speak. His eyes were a language all their own, conveying every thought that words could never hope to capture. The candlelight cast elongated shadows along the walls, flickering like tiny, ephemeral specters. Clara watched them, feeling a curious mix of nervousness and excitement ripple through her. She reached out instinctively to the nearest candle, letting her fingers brush its warm, waxed surface. The heat was comforting, grounding her in the moment, reminding her that she was here alive and experiencing something far more intricate than the simple act of dressing for a night that promised intimacy. It was a ritual of trust, one she had learned to navigate not through spoken assurances, but through the steadiness of a hand, the certainty of a gaze, the subtle reassurance of presence. Clara's reflection seemed to move independently, almost a separate entity observing the quiet grace of her own body. There was strength in her stillness, a confidence shaped by years of self-reliance and adaptation. Yet underneath that strength was a fragile anticipation, a thrill tinged with hesitation. The anticipation wasn't solely for the physical closeness she would share with Ethan. It was the profound vulnerability of opening herself completely, of being understood in a way that transcended spoken language. Ethan remained still, a silent sentinel at the edge of the room, giving Clara space yet simultaneously filling it with his attentive presence. His eyes traced every movement, from the subtle shift of her shoulders to the way her fingers lingered on the lace of her dress. In those eyes, Clara felt seen in a way that was rare, a recognition that went beyond the superficial. She knew that whatever unfolded tonight, Ethan's silence was not emptiness. It was a deliberate, thoughtful communication, an unspoken promise that he would meet her on the same level of trust and intimacy she offered. This, Clara realized, was the essence of their connection, a profound understanding that did not rely on spoken words. It was the quiet space between heartbeats, the gentle acknowledgement of each other's presence, and the knowledge that, when words fail, love can still speak volumes. In that moment, bathed in candlelight, Clara felt a mixture of serenity and electric anticipation, the first tangible brushstrokes of a night that would be as much about emotional closeness as physical intimacy. She was ready, finally, to step into a space where silence spoke louder than anything else, where vulnerability and trust intertwined to create something transcendent, something only the two of them could understand. The room was a sanctuary of soft light and quiet warmth. Candles of various sizes dotted the surfaces, some flickering gently on the windowsill, others standing proudly on the dresser or nightstand. Their flames cast a golden glow that pooled in corners and shimmered across the floor, making shadows dance as if they were participating in a silent ritual. The scent of vanilla and faint lavender lingered in the air, subtle but enveloping, a calm antidote to the thrum of anticipation that Clara felt in her chest. Every detail had been carefully chosen to create a space where vulnerability could feel safe and intimacy could flourish. Clara moved slowly across the room, her bare feet brushing against the soft rug that cushioned each step. Each motion seemed amplified in the candlelight, the way her fingers traced the folds of her dress, the gentle sway of her hair over her shoulders, the delicate rise and fall of her chest with each breath. In the quiet, these small gestures became monumental, as though the room itself were holding its breath in anticipation. Clara was acutely aware of every texture, every sensation, the whisper of silk against her skin, the warmth radiating from the candles, the subtle draft that caressed her shoulders. It was as if the room itself had been constructed to heighten every detail of the moment, turning the ordinary act of preparing for a night with her husband into a sensory revelation. Ethan remained near the doorway, his presence a steady anchor in the soft turbulence of Clara's emotions. He said nothing, and that was exactly what made the moment so profound. In the quiet, his gaze became a language, rich with nuance and intent. He observed her movements with a reverence that bordered on worship, eyes tracing every line, every subtle motion. Each blink, each tilt of his head was a sentence in an unspoken dialogue that neither needed words nor explanation. Clara felt it deep in her chest, the magnetic pull of being understood so completely that no language could hope to contain it. The candles seemed to respond to her mood, their flames dancing in rhythm with her heartbeat. Shadows played along the walls, stretching and bending in ways that mirrored the ebb and flow of her emotions. She reached for a small votive, her fingers brushing the warm wax, and for a moment the tactile sensation grounded her, rooting her in the here and now. Every sense was heightened, the smell of melted wax, the warmth of the flame, the soft creak of the floor beneath her feet. Even the faintest draft from the slightly ajar window became a caress, a reminder that the world outside had faded, leaving only the intimacy of the room and the presence of Ethan. Clara's mind wandered, replaying moments from their courtship, from stolen glances to shared silences. She realized that their connection had always been built on these small, delicate observations, on listening without hearing, on seeing without speaking, on understanding without words. The room reflected that intimacy, each element chosen to amplify the quiet intensity of their bond. Every candle, every shadow, every flicker of light became a participant in their unspoken story, a story that required no verbal articulation to be felt completely. Ethan stepped a little closer, and Clara felt the room shrink, not in size but in focus. The rest of the world disappeared, leaving only them, the candlelight and the unspoken understanding that linked them. He tilted his head slightly, a gesture that held reassurance and desire all at once. Clara returned the look, her heart hammering in a rhythm that seemed to sync with the flickering flames. No words were necessary. The room, the moment, and the gaze they shared spoke volumes. In that candlelit sanctuary, Clara allowed herself to breathe fully, to surrender to the intimacy of preparation and anticipation. The ambiance had done more than set the scene. It had created a cocoon where vulnerability could exist without fear, where trust could deepen without the distraction of conversation, and where love could be expressed through presence alone. Every detail, the warmth, the fragrance, the light, the shadows, worked together to form a space where every glance and gesture carried weight, a space that belonged entirely to them. It was in this setting, alive with subtle tension and profound comfort, that Clara realized something essential. Intimacy was not simply about proximity or physical touch. It was about awareness, attention, and the willingness to meet someone fully in the silence that exists between words. And as she took another slow step forward, feeling the warmth of candlelight on her skin and the unwavering presence of Ethan at her side, she knew that this night would be remembered not for what was said, but for what was felt. The silence between them was heavy, yet alive, an almost tangible presence that wrapped around Clara like a second skin. It wasn't the awkward or uneasy kind of silence that fills empty rooms. It was deliberate, measured, and intimate. In that quiet, she could hear the subtle rhythm of her own breathing, the gentle sway of the curtains stirred by the evening breeze, and the faint crackle of the candles as they burned low. Every small sound became magnified in a way that made the room feel both vast and intimately contained. Clara's eyes met Ethan's, and in that instant, the space between them seemed to shrink. His gaze was steady, unwavering, a calm anchor in the sea of her fluttering thoughts. Words were unnecessary. She could feel the depth of his attention in the warmth of his eyes, the slight lift of his brow, the way his shoulders relaxed as if to say, "I am here, and I see you." She realized that this was a language she had always known, long before they ever exchanged vows, a language that required no spoken syllables, only presence and focus. She shifted slightly, the soft rustle of fabric echoing in the quiet room, and felt a shiver run down her spine. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was anticipation, a thrill that came from exposing herself not only physically but emotionally. To be completely seen by another person without words to hide behind required a courage she had rarely summoned. And yet, in Ethan's silent gaze, she found a safe haven. There was no judgment in his eyes, only reverence, desire, and unwavering affection. He stayed still, letting the moment breathe, allowing Clara the space to approach intimacy on her own terms. Clara's hand lingered on the lace of her dress. She took a deep, grounding breath, feeling the warmth of her own skin in contrast to the cool air of the room. Every sense seemed heightened in the silence. The smell of candle wax, faintly sweet and smoky, the soft glow of the flames painting shadows across the walls, the subtle brush of fabric against her shoulders. In that moment, she realized that silence was not an absence, it was a conduit, an amplifier of every sensation, every unspoken emotion between them. Ethan's eyes followed her movements, but they did more than observe. They communicated. There was a softness in the way he watched her, a patience that told her she could take her time. There was desire, too, restrained and respectful, a reminder that intimacy was as much about giving space as it was about closeness. Clara felt herself responding, her own gaze softening, conveying trust and yearning. The room was filled with a dialogue composed entirely of looks, subtle gestures, and the rhythm of their breathing. Time seemed to stretch, elongating each second into an eternity. Clara's heart beat faster, but in tandem with the measured calm of Ethan's presence, it created a harmony that was almost musical. She realized that this silence was an intimate embrace, a shared understanding that did not need words to exist. In fact, words might have broken it. Here, in the quiet, every glance, every tilt of the head, every blink carried meaning far richer than language could capture. As she moved closer, their proximity became a silent conversation of its own. The faint heat of his body radiated toward her, comforting and grounding. Ethan's hand lifted slightly, inviting without demanding, and Clara responded instinctively, letting her fingers brush against his. That single, almost imperceptible touch spoke volumes: affirmation, desire, trust, all condensed into one silent gesture. For Clara, the silence was liberating. It allowed her to be entirely present in the moment, to experience Ethan fully without distraction. She could sense his admiration in the way his eyes lingered, his patience in the way he never rushed, and his love in the way he simply was. In return, she offered herself fully, not just physically but emotionally, letting her vulnerability meet his unwavering attention. By the time the candles had burned lower and shadows stretched lazily across the room, Clara understood something profound. Intimacy was not merely physical or verbal. It was a presence, a shared awareness, a quiet acknowledgement of each other's existence in its most honest form. And in that silence, she felt closer to Ethan than she had ever felt to anyone, not through words, but through understanding, trust, and the unspoken poetry of shared presence. Clara's fingers trembled slightly as they hovered over the fabric of her gown. The lace felt soft and fragile under her touch, yet it was a barrier she had grown used to wearing, a small armor she had carried into the world. Now in the quiet candlelight, that armor felt unnecessary, even stifling. The room seemed to hum with anticipation, not from sound, but from the electric tension that comes when two people are fully aware of each other, fully present, and fully vulnerable. She drew a slow breath, letting it fill her lungs, feeling the weight of the day, the wedding, the vows, the smiles and congratulations, fall away like petals from a flower. Her vulnerability was not just physical, it was emotional, raw in ways she hadn't allowed herself to be for years. She was exposing her body, yes, but more importantly, she was exposing her trust, her heart, her willingness to surrender herself entirely to someone else. Ethan's gaze followed her, patient and unwavering. He said nothing, but that silence was a gift. In that quiet, Clara could measure his intent, feel the steadiness of his love, and allow herself to relax into the intimacy that had been building for weeks, months, years. Every flicker of candlelight that danced across his features seemed to whisper reassurance. I am here.
I see you.
You are safe. As she began to lift the delicate fabric over her shoulders, a shiver ran down her spine, not from cold, but from the exhilaration of being fully seen. She hesitated for a moment, almost instinctively, aware of how much she was revealing. Her reflection in the mirror caught her gaze, and she saw more than just her form. She saw courage, softness, and an honesty that few had ever witnessed. Clara's heart raced, a mix of fear and anticipation, but beneath it all was a profound trust. She knew Ethan's eyes would honor her, that he would hold nothing but admiration and reverence for the vulnerability she offered. The candlelight highlighted every subtle movement, every curve and line of her body, but it also softened her insecurities. Shadows danced across the walls, painting the room with intimacy and quiet reverence. Each flicker seemed to echo the rhythm of her heartbeat, slow and deliberate, as if the universe itself were pausing to acknowledge this moment. Clara felt the weight of expectation lift. She wasn't performing for anyone, wasn't hiding for anyone, she was simply being. And in that simple act, she found liberation, a sense of empowerment in her vulnerability. Ethan's presence was constant, but unobtrusive. He did not advance, did not reach out prematurely. He waited, allowing Clara to dictate the pace, to guide the moment. His gaze conveyed everything words might have failed to express. Desire tempered with respect, admiration tempered with tenderness, love tempered with patience. Every blink, every slight shift of his posture, every subtle breath he took was a silent affirmation of her trust, a reassurance that she was fully embraced, fully accepted, fully loved. Clara's hands moved to the straps of her gown, sliding them gently down her arms, each movement a quiet assertion of trust. She could feel the air touch her skin in new ways, and the sensation made her heart flutter. Her vulnerability, far from making her feel weak, made her feel alive in a way that few moments ever had. She realized that intimacy was not about perfection or performance, it was about honesty, about allowing oneself to be fully present and fully known, and trusting that the other person would honor that offering. In that candlelit room, surrounded by shadows and flickering light, Clara's vulnerability became a bridge between herself and Ethan. It was a bridge built on trust, patience, and deep emotional connection. She felt seen, truly seen, and in that recognition, she discovered a kind of freedom that was rare and intoxicating. She was not afraid anymore, not of being judged, not of being misunderstood, not of being exposed. She was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly the person she trusted most. As she stood there, partially undressed and fully unguarded, she felt a surge of emotion so profound it made her breath catch. It was fear, yes, but it was also exhilaration, anticipation, and an overwhelming sense of belonging. Her vulnerability, once a source of hesitation, had transformed into a conduit for intimacy, creating a space where love, desire, and trust could converge in a quiet, unspoken symphony. And in that moment, Clara knew that this night would mark more than the beginning of their married life. It would be a celebration of the trust and connection that allowed vulnerability to become strength, and silence to become the most eloquent form of expression. Ethan stood quietly at the edge of the room, an unwavering presence that seemed to fill the space without making a sound. Every flicker of candlelight revealed the careful attentiveness in his posture, the subtle intensity in his eyes. He didn't speak, and he didn't need to. Words had always felt cumbersome in moments like this. They were too blunt, too finite, too incapable of capturing the depth of feeling that flowed between them. Instead, his devotion was a language of stillness, a careful observation that spoke of reverence, desire, and an almost sacred respect for Clara's trust. Clara sensed it immediately, the way his gaze followed her without interruption, the way it softened when it landed on her. There was a patience there that went beyond ordinary understanding, a willingness to let her move at her own pace, to let her dictate the rhythm of intimacy. Ethan's silence was not absence, it was intentional, a deliberate choice to communicate through presence rather than speech. Each blink, each slow breath, each subtle shift of his weight was a wordless message. I am here. I am with you. I honor you. The candlelight caught the planes of his face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw, the gentle curve of his lips, and the warmth in his eyes that never wavered. Ethan's gaze was magnetic in its quiet intensity, drawing Clara closer not through command but through trust. She could feel the heat of his attention, a steady, unwavering force that wrapped around her like an invisible embrace. In that silence, every inch of distance between them dissolved, replaced by an intimate closeness that transcended touch. Clara's movements were measured, tentative at first, as if testing the boundaries of her own courage. Ethan's eyes followed every motion, not with judgment, not with impatience, but with an unwavering devotion that encouraged her to be herself fully. He noticed the slight tremor of her hand as it grazed her shoulder, the way her chest rose and fell with controlled anticipation, the small catch in her breath as she allowed herself to be seen. He saw her vulnerability and responded not with words but with quiet reverence, letting her know she was safe, cherished, and adored. He did not move closer until Clara initiated it, but even then his presence was a steady grounding force. Every subtle gesture, leaning slightly toward her, lifting his hand in invitation without pressure, offering a small, reassuring smile, spoke louder than any spoken vow. In Ethan's silence, Clara found a freedom she had not known before, the freedom to be fully herself, to surrender her defenses, to explore the intimacy of their connection without fear. Their shared silence became a symphony of subtle communication. A tilt of his head invited her to meet his gaze. A slow exhale told her he understood her hesitation. A gentle blink conveyed appreciation for her courage. Each movement, each look became part of an unspoken conversation that wove together trust, desire, and unconditional acceptance. Clara realized that Ethan's devotion was not performative or fleeting. It was a living, breathing force that existed entirely to honor her presence, her choices, and her vulnerability. As she let the last of her lace fall away, revealing herself fully in the candlelight, Ethan's eyes held no expectation, no pressure, no judgment, only unwavering devotion. That gaze, intense and tender all at once, communicated everything she needed to hear. Admiration, love, desire, and a promise that he would remain by her side, fully present no matter what unfolded. In that room, bathed in golden candlelight, Clara understood the depth of Ethan's silent devotion. It was more than attention. It was recognition, celebration, and protection of her vulnerability. It was a commitment to honoring her, not through words, but through presence, patience, and the careful language of the eyes and subtle gestures. She felt herself melt into that devotion, her own heartbeat sinking with his, her trust growing with every measured moment. Ethan stayed silent, allowing their connection to breathe and grow, demonstrating a devotion so profound that it transcended the need for speech. In that quiet, in that candle-lit sanctuary, Clara felt completely seen and completely loved. And in that knowledge, she found the courage to meet him fully, to surrender to the intimacy of the night, and to trust that their unspoken bond would guide them through every tender, vulnerable moment that lay ahead. The silence between them seemed to deepen, stretching across the room like a living entity, full of unspoken promises and electric tension. Clara's fingers brushed tentatively against the soft fabric of her gown as she moved closer to Ethan, feeling the warmth radiating from his body. Her touch was cautious at first, almost shy, but the subtle intensity in his gaze encouraged her to explore further. It was in that delicate exchange, the meeting of hands and skin, that the true language of touch began to unfold, spoken not with words but with intention, patience, and a mutual understanding that needed no translation. Ethan lifted his hand slightly, fingers hovering near hers, giving her the choice to bridge the gap. The gesture was gentle yet commanding in its restraint, a silent invitation to step closer, to connect. Clara responded instinctively, letting her palm graze the back of his hand, feeling the warmth and strength there. That single contact spoke volumes, a wordless conversation that expressed trust, anticipation, and recognition. The room seemed to hum around them, the flickering candlelight casting shadows that danced along their intertwined forms, creating a visual echo of their growing intimacy. Every touch that followed was deliberate, tender, and deeply meaningful. Clara's fingertips traced the outline of Ethan's hand, feeling the subtle calluses that spoke of years of hard work, of resilience. She felt a shiver of excitement at the realization that this was more than physical closeness. It was a dialogue between souls, a translation of feelings that words could never adequately convey. Ethan responded with equal care, his hand brushing along her arm, tracing the curve of her shoulder, each movement an affirmation of the trust she offered and the desire he felt. Clara's breathing deepened, slow and deliberate, as she became increasingly attuned to the nuances of their touch. Every movement communicated something unique: hesitation, reassurance, longing, or admiration. She realized that intimacy was not merely the act of physical closeness but the conscious acknowledgement of each other's presence and emotional state. Ethan's fingers lingered on her wrist for just a heartbeat longer than necessary, a gesture that conveyed more than words ever could. "I see you. I feel you. I am here with you." The candlelight flickered across their faces, illuminating the intensity in Ethan's eyes and reflecting Clara's own mixture of vulnerability and anticipation. Each brush of skin against skin created a feedback loop of emotion and trust, reinforcing the connection that had always existed between them, but had never been so physically expressed. Their hands moved with a quiet rhythm, discovering, exploring, and affirming each other's presence. Touch became their vocabulary, and in it they found clarity, comfort, and desire. Clara leaned slightly into Ethan's warmth, the subtle pressure of his body grounding her as she surrendered more fully to the moment. She felt the strength in his arms and the gentleness in his movements, a balance that communicated both passion and protection. In response, Ethan's hands traveled softly along her back and shoulders, careful not to rush, careful to honor every inch of her vulnerability. The language of touch was patient, deliberate, and profoundly intimate, a conversation in which each caress, brush, or clasp of hands conveyed emotions that words could never encapsulate. The room seemed to shrink around them, the flickering flames creating an enclosed world where only their sensations existed. Clara's heartbeat aligned with the rhythm of Ethan's breaths, a silent synchronization that deepened their connection. Every subtle movement became an act of affirmation, a reminder that they were fully present for each other, fully attuned to the nuances of body and emotion. As their hands intertwined and lingered, the language of touch reached its full potential, conveying love, desire, trust, and devotion all at once. It was a silent dialogue, a sacred exchange that transcended words, leaving them both suspended in the intimacy of shared understanding. Clara realized that tonight, more than any other moment in their relationship, the touch between them was a living testament to their bond, a dialogue that neither needed explanation nor interruption. In the quiet, flickering candlelight, Clara and Ethan spoke fluently in the language of touch, a language that was intimate, honest, and transformative. Every caress, every brush of skin, every lingering hand reinforced the trust and connection that had carried them to this night. And in that language, without a single word spoken, they understood each other completely. The room seemed suspended in time, each flicker of candlelight accentuating the intimacy that had been building for hours. Clara felt a shiver run through her, not from the chill in the air, but from the intensity of the connection that had been steadily growing between her and Ethan. Every glance, every subtle gesture, every touch had layered on itself, creating a tension so electric that it seemed almost impossible to contain. The emotional weight of the night, the trust, the vulnerability, the unspoken longing, had reached a crescendo, and Clara felt herself teetering on the edge of something transcendent. Ethan's eyes never wavered from hers. In their depths, Clara saw patience, desire, and a reverence so profound it made her chest ache with longing. He stayed silent, letting the moment stretch, letting her absorb the totality of his devotion before moving a single step closer. She realized that his silence was not passive. It was intentional, a conscious choice to honor the gravity of their connection and to allow her vulnerability to unfold at its own pace. In that quiet, she could feel the intensity of his emotions, radiating outward, a palpable force that enveloped her completely. Clara's hands trembled as she reached for him, brushing against his chest, feeling the warmth beneath his shirt, the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath her fingertips. That simple contact sent a wave of electricity through her, making her acutely aware of every nerve ending, every inch of skin, every breath. She leaned closer, her forehead almost touching his, and in that intimate proximity, the tension between them felt like a living entity, hungry, urgent, yet patient. The air seemed to vibrate with the weight of unspoken words and the depth of emotion that had been simmering all evening. Every glance Ethan gave her, every slight nod or tilt of his head carried meaning. He was telling her, without speaking, that he saw her completely, that he admired her courage, that he desired her wholly. Clara's pulse quickened, and she realized how much she had been longing for this unfiltered, unspoken acknowledgement of her vulnerability and their connection. There was no rush, no pressure, only the exquisite, almost painful anticipation of two people fully attuned to each other's presence. Her breathing became shallow as she let herself sink into the intensity of the moment. Each small touch, brush of his hand along her arm, the gentle resting of her fingers on his shoulder, was a confirmation, a dialogue of desire and trust. The emotional energy in the room was thick, a living current that seemed to pulse in rhythm with their hearts. Every sensation was magnified. The warmth of skin, the brush of fingertips, the heat in their gazes, the flickering shadows that danced across their forms. Clara realized that she had never felt such a perfect intersection of desire and security. Her vulnerability was not a weakness here, it was a gift, and Ethan's silent devotion honored it fully. In that candlelit room, she felt herself letting go completely, surrendering to the intimacy of the moment without fear. Her hands found his face, tracing the contours with gentle reverence, and Ethan responded with the same tenderness, his fingers lingering against her skin with a reverent patience that made her heart ache. Time lost meaning. Minutes stretched into hours, yet everything felt suspended in perfect alignment, as though the world beyond the walls had ceased to exist. Clara's vulnerability and Ethan's devotion intertwined, creating a connection that transcended the physical, a communion of hearts and souls that needed no words. Every blink, every sigh, every lingering gaze was part of a dialogue more profound than any language she had ever known. Finally, as the candles burned low and shadows grew long, Clara and Ethan stood together in the stillness, their bodies close, their breaths mingling, and their hearts beating in quiet synchronization. The emotional climax of the evening was not a single action or moment, but the culmination of hours of trust, patience, and intimate attention. In that silent, candlelit room, they had reached a pinnacle of understanding, a place where love, desire, and vulnerability coexisted in perfect harmony. In that electric, intimate stillness, Clara realized that the true climax was not in the physical but in the profound emotional connection that had been built, nurtured, and honored throughout the evening. And in Ethan's unwavering gaze, she understood that their love needed no words, for it had already spoken everything essential. The room had grown quieter still, if that were even possible. The candles had burned low, their golden flames casting long, intimate shadows that seemed to wrap around Clara and Ethan like a protective cocoon. In the silence that remained after the emotional crescendo of the evening, a deeper, subtler connection began to emerge, a mutual understanding that transcended even the most charged moments of desire. It was the knowledge that they were not just physically close but emotionally aligned, that every subtle glance and touch carried the weight of shared trust and respect. Clara gazed at Ethan, seeing in his eyes a reflection of her own vulnerability, tempered with admiration and unwavering devotion. It was a look that spoke of recognition, of acknowledgement, of a profound awareness of the person before him, not just the body, not just the external, but the entirety of who she was. In that gaze, she felt herself truly seen, beyond the surface, beyond pretense. For the first time in a long time, she realized that her silence, her way of experiencing the world, was not a barrier, but a bridge. Ethan understood her not through words, but through the steady, patient attention he had offered all evening. Ethan returned her gaze, and in his eyes, Clara saw more than admiration. She saw a reflection of her own courage, her willingness to embrace vulnerability without fear. He saw not just the outward signs of her trust, but the internal surrender, the emotional exposure that made intimacy truly profound. In that moment, both of them recognized a truth. Love was not measured by words nor by grand gestures, but by the consistent, quiet affirmation of presence and attention. Their hands found each other again, fingers intertwining naturally, without thought or instruction. The simple act spoke volumes. It was a gesture of reassurance, of equality, of shared experience. Clara pressed her palm against his, feeling the warmth and strength there, and Ethan responded with a gentle squeeze, a silent affirmation that he was present, that he would not falter, and that he honored every ounce of her vulnerability. In that mutual understanding, they found balance. It was a give and take, a dialogue conducted entirely without speech, yet richer than any conversation they had ever shared. The silence between them became a canvas, allowing each subtle movement to carry meaning. A tilt of the head, a lingering look, a soft sigh. All of it contributed to a shared narrative that neither needed to articulate. Clara felt an overwhelming sense of safety, not just in Ethan's presence but in the reciprocity of their connection. She knew that she could trust him completely, as he trusted her, and that trust became the foundation upon which their intimacy could flourish. Even as the night stretched on, and the physical intensity of the earlier moments softened into a warm, steady closeness, the mutual understanding persisted. Their bodies relaxed into each other, but their awareness of one another remained acute. Clara could feel the subtle shifts in Ethan's breathing, the tension release in his shoulders, the gentle cadence of his heartbeat. In return, Ethan was attuned to her every movement, every change in expression, every nuance of her mood. It was a quiet synchronization, a seamless alignment of two people fully present with each other. In that candlelit room, mutual understanding became the ultimate intimacy. It was a connection that transcended spoken language, one built on presence, patience, and unwavering attentiveness. Clara realized that the bond they shared could not be replicated by mere words. It existed in the way they observed and responded to each other, in the silent agreements woven into every glance and gesture. This understanding was enduring, a thread that would carry forward beyond the night into every day they would share. As the flames flickered and shadows danced across the walls, Clara and Ethan remained entwined, bodies and hearts aligned. They had arrived at a place of quiet equilibrium, a sacred space where love, desire, vulnerability, and trust converged. In that shared silence, each of them understood the other completely, and in that understanding they found a profound peace, a reaffirmation that their connection was unshakable, unspoken, and entirely mutual. The candles had burned even lower now, their soft golden glow casting a gentle warmth across the room. The shadows danced lazily along the walls, elongating and curling as if they were in no rush, reflecting the slow, deliberate rhythm that had settled over Clara and Ethan. Time itself seemed suspended, reduced to the faint flicker of flame and the quiet breathing of two bodies intertwined. In this reverie, the world beyond the room no longer existed. There was only the present, the delicate intimacy and the shared heartbeat of a connection that needed no words. Clara leaned back against Ethan, feeling the steady warmth of his chest beneath her cheek. The pressure was soft, comforting, and grounding, a reminder that she was completely safe in his presence. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself absorb the sensation, the warmth of his skin, the slow rise and fall of his chest, the subtle scent of his cologne mingling with the lingering aroma of melted wax. Every detail heightened the awareness of her own body and of the closeness they shared, and she felt a shiver of contentment ripple through her. Ethan remained still, his hands lightly resting on her back and shoulders, not moving too quickly, not breaking the delicate rhythm of their quiet reverie. His devotion was silent yet palpable, a constant reassurance that this space belonged entirely to them. In his stillness, Clara felt an expansive sense of freedom. She could simply be, without expectation, without performance, without fear, and she felt cherished for simply existing. Each subtle gesture, from the gentle pressure of his fingers to the occasional shift of his hand across her shoulder, communicated love, respect, and desire in a way that words could never fully convey. The candlelight itself seemed to participate in their reverie, flickering across the room like a private orchestra of shadows and light. Every curve, every line of their intertwined forms was accentuated and softened in equal measure, making the room feel both intimate and eternal. Clara opened her eyes, letting them rest on Ethan's face, and in that gaze she saw the reflection of her own emotions. Serenity, awe, trust, and a profound sense of being known. The silence between them deepened, filled not with absence but with understanding, a quiet dialogue of presence and attention. Clara's hand moved slowly along Ethan's arm, following the contours of his muscles, and he responded in kind, letting his fingers trace the line of her back. Each touch was deliberate, patient, and measured, creating a rhythm that felt both sacred and sensuous. In that moment, the intimacy they shared was not simply physical. It was a communion of awareness, an acknowledgement of each other's presence, a celebration of the trust and vulnerability that had brought them to this point. Every contact, however slight, reinforced the profound connection they had cultivated in silence. Time lost all relevance. Minutes, hours. They dissolved into the steady cadence of their shared breathing, the subtle interplay of warmth and touch, the soft glow of candlelight reflected in their eyes. Clara's heart beat in quiet synchrony with Ethan's, each thump a reaffirmation of presence, of devotion, of mutual understanding. The world outside the room, the wedding, the congratulations, the noise, had faded completely, leaving only the soft intimacy of the candlelit space and the resonance of two hearts attuned to one another. In that candlelit reverie, Clara felt a sense of permanence, a quiet certainty that the love and trust they shared would extend far beyond this night. It was not defined by words or dramatic gestures, but by the subtle, sustained attention and care they offered one another. Every flicker of the flame, every gentle caress, every shared glance became part of a private, sacred rhythm, one that neither of them would ever forget. As the candle's flames dwindled to soft, quivering points of light, Clara and Ethan remained wrapped in each other's presence, their bodies pressed together, their hands intertwined, their eyes locked in unspoken understanding. They existed in a moment that was at once fleeting and eternal, a candlelit reverie that captured the essence of their love, trust and intimacy in a language beyond words. The candles had finally burned down to their last few flames, casting a soft amber glow that clung to the room like a warm embrace. Shadows stretched along the walls, whispering across the floor and pooling in corners. But there was no longer any tension in the space. Clara and Ethan lay together, bodies close, hearts still beating in quiet synchrony. The intensity of the night had given way to a calm, profound closeness, a sense of peace that only comes after trust has been tested, vulnerability has been shared, and connection has been fully acknowledged. Clara rested her head against Ethan's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear. Each pulse was a gentle reassurance, a silent declaration that he was there, that he would remain present, that nothing she had revealed, physically, emotionally, or spiritually, had altered the foundation of their bond. In his silence, she found clarity. Their love was not dependent on words or declarations, but on presence, attention, and the continuous, deliberate act of seeing and being seen. Ethan's arms cradled her gently, holding her in a secure cocoon of warmth. He said nothing, but Clara could feel every ounce of his devotion in the careful pressure of his hands, in the way his fingers traced lazy patterns across her back, and in the steady, unwavering gaze he had given her throughout the night. He had communicated everything she needed through silence, through touch, through steady presence, through eyes that spoke a language richer than words. In that quiet, Clara felt fully known, fully accepted, and fully loved. The room itself seemed to lean into their intimacy, the last flickers of candlelight softening into golden pools on the walls. The shadows seemed to pause as if acknowledging the sanctity of this moment. Clara lifted her gaze to meet Ethan's, and in that shared look, every unspoken thought, every hidden feeling, every depth of desire and trust was laid bare. There were no words, no need for them. The entirety of their connection, the vulnerability, the admiration, the passion, the tenderness, was captured in a single, sustained exchange of eyes. Clara traced her fingers gently along Ethan's face, feeling the warmth of his skin, the subtle texture of his jaw, the softness of his expression. He leaned into her touch, and in that movement, she felt the culmination of every tender, silent gesture that had preceded it. It was not about urgency or need, it was about alignment, harmony, and mutual recognition. In that quiet intimacy, she realized that love at its deepest was not a matter of speech, but of perception, noticing, understanding, honoring, and responding with unwavering attention and care. As they lay together side by side, the emotional tension of the evening softened into a profound sense of serenity. Clara felt a smile tug at her lips, not a smile of amusement or performance, but of contentment, of recognition that she had been seen and cherished in a way few people ever truly experience. Ethan returned her gaze, lips curving subtly, and in that mirrored expression, Clara understood that their love was complete. Not because of grand declarations, not because of dramatic gestures, but because it had been sustained, nurtured, and expressed through every silent moment of connection. Their fingers intertwined, resting lazily atop one another, a tactile symbol of trust and shared understanding. Each heartbeat, each small shift in position, each quiet exhale reinforced the bond they had spent the evening deepening. This was more than intimacy, it was communion, a sacred understanding that transcended words, time, and even the physical presence of the outside world. Finally, as the room settled into near darkness, Clara rested her cheek against Ethan's chest and felt a profound truth settle into her bones. Love could exist beyond language, beyond expectation, beyond even the boundaries of the physical. True love was presence, patience, and trust, an unbroken chain of attention and care that did not need to be spoken to be felt. In that quiet, candlelit room they had discovered the most intimate expression of love possible, one in which words were unnecessary, because every glance, every touch, and every heartbeat had already said everything. As they drifted into a shared, peaceful silence, the room seemed to hold its breath with them, the shadows of candlelight flickering faintly before fading into stillness. In that moment, Clara and Ethan understood fully that their bond was eternal, a love beyond words, spoken only through presence, understanding, and unwavering devotion.